Isn't that the fundamental barrier? Human beings can tolerate an immortal robot, but it doesn't matter how long a machine lasts. They cannot tolerate an immortal human being, since their own mortality is endurable only so long as it is universal. And for that reason, they won't make me a human being. Li Xing said, "What is it you're leading up to, Andrew?" "I have removed that problem." Justin Reich, welcome.
Strangely, we're on topic. Sorry, go ahead.
We are both off topic and on topic. Justin Reich, welcome to Upper Middlebrow. You are joining us. Chris Bagg is not here, unfortunately, but you and I have read the first half of Isaac Asimov's Robot Visions, a collection of Asimov's robot stories that go back to the late 30s through the 70s or 80s. Incredible. Or something like
Nearly
that.
100 years old, 90 years old.
Yeah. And I think it's a great collection, and we're going to talk about that.
I'm here for it.
So welcome. I don't think we're going to recap all of the stories. There are 11 stories in the first half, the earliest of which is called Robbie, which was published in 1940 when Asimov was 20. The stories have some of the same characters in common, including probably most notably Dr. Susan Calvin, who is a robo-psychologist. The stories actually introduce the word robotics into the English language, and they're set in what Asimov would have considered to be a distant future, but for us it might not seem quite so distant. And all of these stories have something to do with the interplay of what Asimov defines as the 3 laws of robotics. So I'm going to give those to you. 1, a robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. 2, a robot must obey the orders given it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. And 3, a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. And I think that's really all we need to say about them.
Yeah.
Question for both of us. Which was your favorite story from this collection?
The story which gripped me was Gloria, the story of Robbie. It's one of the very first stories. Are they in chronological order?
I'm not sure, but I do believe this is the first short story that Asimov ever wrote and published. Anyway,
it is actually called Robbie. There are 2 characters in the story. Robbie is the robot, and Gloria is a child. So it's from the early 1940s. And it basically, the premise is, what will parents do when children are socialized to love and find exclusive companionship with robots? And that is just an unbelievably salient question in 2025. And I think Asimov's prediction of this in 1941 is astonishing. I will say that I didn't actually find the writing that compelling. I was a pretty big Foundation fan when I was a kid. I was always less of a robot kid. I think I read a few things. I can clearly remember moments from the Foundation series where there was some twist or turn, particularly in the kind of sort of galactic plot of intrigues, where I was just I had no idea that was coming. That was amazing.
The clown was the mule all along.
The clown was a mule all along. Those kind of, but what you don't understand, Mr. Selden, is that we have planned for this since the da-da-da. And I can't even remember what they were now, but I remember finding it incredibly compelling. These stories are, I don't find the writing all that gripping. Some of the characterization I think is pretty great. Some of it less so. But boy, taking the each premise is a little gem, and their salience decades later is astonishing.
Yeah, well, this is like a 19-year-old writer we're talking about too with yes. Robbie, and I agree that there's a clunkiness to the writing. There's clunkiness to some of the characterization, but I also find it really hit and miss throughout too. And like Susan Calvin as a character, I think is just fascinatingly like problematic and wonderful and terrible in many different regards. But I mean, let's
Susan
pause.
Calvin is the robot psychologist,
right?
Who she's this kind of incredible, comes to her position through a kind of principled misanthropy. Like she really doesn't like humans and sort of admired robots. She's an amazing character.
At one point, somebody asks her like, "What's the difference between humans and robots?" And she says, "Oh, they're quite different. Robots are fundamentally decent."
Yeah, incredible. And I liked her so much better in the later stories. She becomes a much richer character. And maybe we'll talk about that more as we go on.
I think the thing that you're noting about Asimov's writing, I think his writing gets better. I think the characters become more dimensional. I think that his prose gets better. But if you consider, let's go back to Robbie. If we're going to consider that, this is a work of genius for like a 19-year-old, I think. And it's interesting to me the way that you characterized it, which is this is a story about what will parents do when their children are socialized to love, relate, have friendships with robots. I don't disagree with that. Although if you read the story without that analysis, it's a story about what a little girl will do when her friend is taken away from her. You know, it's
maybe we should say the plot briefly, which is that there's a family who's bought Robbie the robot. Robbie is very primitive, doesn't seem to be able to talk, communicates through gestures, and is there principally to take care of or be around for this little girl, Gloria, who is completely enamored. They've developed a kind of sign language to talk with each other. Early in the story, Robbie asks Gloria to retell the story of Cinderella, and Gloria protests that she's told it 1,000 times, and he must be bored of it by now, but she relents and tells the story. And Gloria's mom is upset at how much time they're spending together. We find out also Gloria's mom is upset that the neighbors are concerned and suspicious and skeptical of Robbie.
Maybe because the neighbors have like more modern robots too. Is that like sort of part of like
I thought it was still like,
or is it just like that they have a robot at all?
Oh yeah, I think Asimov presupposes that the introduction of robots will be met with societal skepticism, and that's a through line of the whole thing. That the sort of main robot company is always designing to attend to society's fear of robots, fear of robot takeover, those kinds of things.
U.S. Robots and Mechanical Men. U.S. Incredible. Robots and Mechanical Men Corporation, of whom we meet many employers in many different generations and many different iterations too
over the years. And so eventually, Robbie's given away. The wife impresses upon the husband that Robbie needs to go. The husband finally relents, but Robbie is given to like a manufacturing group, and the father arranges a tour of the manufacturing group, and Gloria sees Robbie and bolts away from her family to go give Robbie a hug. A locomotive nearly runs her over. Robbie effortlessly saves her, and the family agrees that Robbie can come back home.
Yeah. Which, like if you look at that plot sort of in one way, the conclusion seems to be that Robbie is a perfectly appropriate playmate for the daughter. I mean, who else would have saved her life, right? It's like the climax at the end, Robbie saves the girl's life, is pretty hard to argue with. Do you think Asimov is being a little bit tricky? Do you think that he's bearing some deeper ideas in what is actually a fairly simple your lost friend is recovered story? Like it could be a Lassie story, right? Like you give the dog away and then you miss the dog and then you go find the dog and the dog does something to get back into the good graces of the family.
It is very Lassie, except for the fact that what motivates Robbie's banishment is primarily the mother's concern that Gloria is not socializing with other humans, that Gloria has developed an exclusive relationship with Robbie that seems to be unhealthy for a human which is meant to be socialized with lots of other humans. And I don't think the ending even resolves that dilemma. It sort of says, okay, Robbie's going to come back home because it's impossible to keep Gloria away from Robbie, but it's not an unambiguously good end. The wife doesn't concede that this is a great idea. In fact, the story ends with the wife saying to the husband, "Hey, you set all this up, didn't you?" And the husband says, "You got me there, but it all worked out. And how are you going to get rid of it now?" So I actually don't. I think the complexity. It remains. It's a subversion of the old Yeller story a little bit. It's the dog is not unambiguously good. The robot remains remains questionable, which is to some extent the theme of all of these stories. That the introduction of robots into society is going to create all kinds of benefits, but is going to come with not only complexities in managing the robots and moral dilemmas and moral questions, but complexities in how humans will relate to one another.
Yeah, I think that's well put. And if, in his introduction, Asimov basically says, like, he said all the he wasn't the first person to write about robots in science fiction. There were other robot stories, but they were always these sort of like Frankenstein monsters, essentially. They always went awry. And they always became murderous or rebellious. And what Asimov does is, well, let's imagine that they work exactly as they're designed to. That will also create conflict, and that will also create fascinating dilemmas as well. And I think that's kind of brilliant. And I think, to your point, the dilemmas feel just as fresh and relevant. I mean, they feel perhaps more fresh and relevant at the dawn of what we might call the dawn of the AI age. As much as I tremble to say that. Do you have a favorite reading from Robbie?
Well, I could do a little bit. I think I think the right moment is when well,
do you have a copy handy?
I do.
Okay.
Please, Robbie, please give me a ride. She encircled his neck with rosy arms and hugged tightly. Then, changing moods in a moment, she moved away. If you don't, I'm going to cry. And her face twisted appallingly in preparation. Hard-hearted Robbie paid scant attention to this dreadful possibility and shook his head a third time. Gloria found it necessary to play her trump card. If you don't, she exclaimed warmly, I won't tell you any more stories. That's all. Not one. Robbie gave in immediately and unconditionally before this ultimatum, nodding his head vigorously until the metal of his neck hummed. Carefully, he raised the little girl and placed her on his broad, flat shoulders. Gloria's threatened tears vanished immediately, and she crowed with delight. Robbie's metal skin, kept at a constant temperature of 70 by the high-resistance coil within, felt nice and comfortable, while the beautiful loud sound her heels made as they bumped rhythmically against his chest was enchanting. You're an air coaster, Robbie. You're a big silver air coaster. Hold your arms straight. You got to, Robbie, if you're going to be an air coaster. The logic was irrefutable. Robbie's arms were wings, catching the air currents, and he was a silver coaster.
As a father and as somebody who's studied child development, I mean, we've already said that Asimov is still honing his craft as a writer. How good of a job do you think he does capturing the bond between a little girl and a robotic playmate?
Well, I mean, it's very babysitterly. There's, you have this sense of like, Robbie is charged with sort of controlling this situation. And I think that the weakness for human stories is just a marvelous weakness. Hearkening back to Frankenstein monsters, love of stories and, desire for family, sort of in that vein, in that tradition, and that Gloria can get Robbie to do something Robbie's not exactly supposed to do, but he kind of he's sort of happy to do it anyway. And in exchange, he gets this story. I think it is both, there's something developmentally right on there. I don't know. Garrison Keillor once said that children are like terrorists. They have nothing to lose, so they tend to come at you with everything they have. And this is a very much one of those, like Gloria's just going to try everything until she gets what she wants.
Well, and in the very early pages, there's she goes from like taunting him cruelly to like being very affectionate to then being demanding. I mean, the very first thing that happens is they're playing hide and seek, and he lets her win. after she demands it, and then she taunts him cruelly, after he's done exactly what he's supposed to do.
And there's so much in there. I have a colleague, Kate Darling, who is a robot ethicist. She was at the MIT Media Lab for a while and has since gone on to private industry. But one of the things that Kate's research reveals is that a lot of robot ethics are drawn from animal ethics in certain kinds of ways, particularly the notion that one of the reasons why we have animal ethics is to prevent humans from being cruel to beings. That there's not actually anything wrong. Sort of, in some senses, you don't have to worry about the chicken suffering when the chicken is tortured. But if you let people torture chickens, they will torture other creatures. So you have to prevent them from doing any kind of torture.
And there's something they will become depraved in their own respect.
They will become depraved and transfer that depraved behavior to humans. And just the fact that Asimov kind of immediately recognizes, like, some human relationships would tolerate that kind of taunting and bantering, but actually a lot of babysitters would not, although it does hearken to kind of like mammy white child relationships where the mammy can't retort in the same kinds of ways. There's a kind of a richness and complexity to it that is even if the prose doesn't always carry that richness and complexity in the best way, you're like, man, there's a lot going on in one of his very first stories.
I mean, there are also echoes of race relations in this too.
Mm-hmm.
In one of the stories, both Susan Calvin and Peter Bogert refer to the robots as boy. The way that they, in Bicentennial Man, the terms of address that the robot servant uses with his human family are the honorifics a servant would use. Sir and ma'am are the mother and father. Miss is the elder sister. Little Miss is the younger sister. When Little Miss has a kid, he is Little Sir. Eventually, that character, Andrew, begins to refer to humans by their actual names. But even Little Miss, who was his playmate and, the first sort of the human to which he has the closest bond, he still thinks of her as Little Miss, 100 years into his age. I mean, this is another extraordinary story that I hope we talk about. So I guess a question, do you read this book as... One of the questions people have about sci-fi, I wish we had Chris here to answer this too, is one theory of sci-fi is that it's about the future. That this is a book where Isaac Asimov is speculating about what robots will mean to humans in the future. Another theory of sci-fi is that it's using futuristic imagery and situations to explore what it means to be human now. Which do you see? I'm curious.
I guess I do see more of the former in Asimov. Not, I mean, he was, he does have a certain kind of social analysis. Social critic is a little strong. Yeah. I mean, in the 8th grade, I took a class on the Greek and Romans, which used out of print Asimov history books as the textbook.
Oh, wow. Asimov
had written a history of the Greeks and the Romans, which as
among his 500 books that he published.
Pretty. So he's a student of human nature. He's a student of history. But I don't. There are other stories in which you feel like the speculative fiction is very much intentionally enacting an allegory of the present, whereas this feels more like a genuine curiosity of maybe we'll have one of these things one day. What would that mean? What's that gonna do? But it certainly intersects with people's interest in the world as it is.
Well, and I think I agree. I do think he's actually speculating, and there's ways in which the speculation proves prescient when he thinks in that some of the same questions that people are discussing about artificial intelligence today are discussed in these stories that were written, in some cases, as you said, 90 years before this era or 80 years before this era. That's pretty extraordinary. I mean, the big thing that he gets wrong is the assumption that the human-like beings, they build the robot form, the mechanical man, first, and they add the brain later. What our society has done, I mean, we have robots that are kind of like arms that assemble cars. We have robotic factories. We have robotic all sorts of robotic things, but we don't really have robots. I mean, some people are building them, but we don't have readily available robots that walk around like humans and are sort of designed to do human tasks. I mean, there are companies that are working on that right now, but really the technology that advanced first for us was arguably a form of the positronic brain, which is the large language model, although I think they're different in some many significant regards. I think I want to tell you what my favorite story is.
Please, tell me your favorite story, Jesse.
It's tough. I really think we should talk about Bicentennial Man. And I think that would be, like you, I think I find one that I like the most, and I find one that to me is the most compelling in terms of something to think about. And I would say that Bicentennial Man is the latter, and I want to reserve some time. I think my favorite story was the one called Evidence. So this is a story where a politician comes to U.S. robots and mechanical. This was also one of my favorite Susan Calvin appearances too, and I feel like this is when Susan Calvin has kind of matured as a character, and Asimov is giving her a little more respect as a person. So U.S. Robots and Mechanical Man gets a visit from a politician who is sure that his political rival is a robot. And they ask him to investigate, or they ask U.S. robots to investigate. The idea being like, oh, if it turns out this is a robot, this is going to be very bad publicity because you're the only company that makes robots, which means you're infiltrating our political system. Then essentially there's this whole story where the character, I forget his name. Do you remember the name of the alleged robot?
Stephen Brierley.
Stephen Brierley deflects all of these attempts to determine whether he is a robot or not. He's never seen to be eating in public. He doesn't seem to sleep, and he is a lawyer, and he refutes all of these claims expertly. And then in sort of the penultimate climax,
even more importantly, he deflects them on privacy grounds. He says something along the lines of, well, I could let you see me eat, but I have a right to my privacy, and in order to, not because I'm trying to deflect from you finding out on the robot, just on the principle of protecting my privacy, I cannot let you look at these things, which I just think is a terrific piece of it.
It's wonderful, and he is his sort of sparring with his political rival is part of the joy, and he's clearly smarter than that guy, and that's what's fun. And then in the climax, he gives a speech, and during the speech, a man insults him and provokes him into punching him. Now, one of the premises of all of these stories are the 3 laws of robotics. And the 3 laws of robotics, the first law is that a robot may not harm a human or through inaction cause a human to be harmed. The second one is that a robot has to protect its own identity, and the third is that they have to obey a human's orders. I might have 2 and 3 mixed up in the order.
They have to. 2 is they have to obey human orders, and 3 is that they cannot let themselves come to harm.
They cannot let themselves. And number 3, the laws are. Number 1 is the most important. Number 2 is the second most important. So number 2, a human cannot order a robot to harm another human because that would violate the first law, et cetera, et cetera. So by punching another human, this man, Byerly, has proven that he is in fact human, and he wins the election, and it turns out he's actually kind of suckered his opponent. So this is exciting, but then Susan Calvin visits him in a sort of epilogue of the story and says, there is one way in which a robot could have punched that man in the crowd, and that is if that man himself was also a robot. And there's this sort of alternative narrative that is plausible given some plot details we get about Byerly's mentor, who perhaps was a robotics engineer who was injured in a crash, who has perhaps built Byerly as a robot and trained him to be kind of his agent in this world, and perhaps built another robot that Byerly could strike, thus convincing the world that he was not, in fact, a robot, but a human. And so according to Stephen Calvin's theory, Byerly is secretly a robot who is ascending to political power. And later we see him in his role as world coordinator, basically like president of the earth, in another story. And Susan Calvin is completely fine with this. She is not at all troubled with the idea that a robot might be impersonating a human politician, because she believes that robots are fundamentally decent and might be better at determining human fate and making decisions for all of humanities than humans themselves are, which is also a fresh and relevant idea today.
An extremely relevant idea. One of the neat things about Susan Calvin's character is that there's a certain sort of sexist presentation of her. There's a mind reading robot in an early story that discovers that she's in love with one of her colleagues, and she's not very good at putting on her makeup and things like that. But actually, soon afterwards, there is still sexism kind of heaped on her. However, she sort of in various ways kind of rises above or sort of turns the tables on the sexists that makes you think more and more in the later stories that like, oh, Asimov is recording the sexism of his era, but does not share it because she doesn't sort of fully share it because she increasingly becomes this heroine character who's kind of, always outdoing the boys. She also is in a position.
She's certainly smarter than her colleagues. Yes.
Yeah.
I agree. I think she's an interesting character. I think she does evolve. I do think that first story, Liar, the one you reference, is sexist.
Yep.
In that, you could argue that the depiction of Susan Calvin as this sort of withering spinster. She's a smart scientist who is misanthropic and perhaps unlucky in love, and that has turned her to focus on robotics. That's the way her colleagues think of her. And they are underestimating her. But it also feels to me like in that story that Asimov is sort of like, well, I'm going to make this smart woman character, so I got to give her some weakness. Well, what would that be? Well, for a woman, she's got to be ugly and she's got to be kind of awkward with men. It feels ham-handed and sort of sexist. I think, though, as the stories progress, she does kind of grow into her role, and she does become kind of anti-sexist and pro-feminist. Asimov always said that he claims credit for a feminist character 30 years before the women's movement of the 1970s. But then he also always wryly acknowledged that feminists didn't seem to agree with him, and that actually relates to my trivia, which is coming up in a few minutes.
Cool.
But anyway, I lost the thread of all of that. I forgot where we were. Do you have a question or a topic?
Well, let's go on to Bicentennial Man, which is this sort of extraordinary. You just framed it earlier in the conversation as an emancipation story. That Andrew is a robot who is in some respects enslaved. In one earlier story, two scientists discover some of the very first robots that were built. Those robots, when they verbalize, refer to people as masters. Brilliant. Asimov is clear that the earliest robots were programmed to do that to prevent anti-robot sentiment. Also, we should get to Bicentennial Man, but another kind of incredibly prescient thing is those robots are only allowed to operate physically. They're only allowed to move around if a human is riding them. A human has to be physically attached to them, which there's a whole field of sort of human in the loop design, which is based on the same principle that that the robots the LLMs are only allowed to take action if there's a human that is sort of approving and guiding their actions, and because Asimov is imagining robots and LLMs as physical things, he's like, well, I guess they got to be writers of them then.
He is. He's wonderfully anticipating the anxieties and fears around artificial intelligence, like applying it in a weird way. But you're exactly right. We don't have robots that we can ride, at least not that I'm aware of, nor is that a safety feature. But it is completely analogous, to the current situation. So you said it's a emancipation story. I think Bicentennial Man is also a story about what it means to be human. And ultimately, to me, it is kind of the most inward looking. But he uses essentially a mechanical man as it's sort of like logical straw man or reductio ad absurdum. Like how much of this mechanical man do you have to replace before you get a human?
Maybe we should do a quick plot summary, which
Sure.
is that Andrew is a robot who incidentally once creates like a piece of furniture, or starts creating a piece of furniture,
wood carving, a beautiful
wood carving.
Yeah.
And people say, oh my gosh, that's amazing. I mean, so where does this come from? There's a claim that his particular positronic brain was created with more space they use something like resonance or something like that, sort of more uncertainty built into it. And therefore it is able of creating a beautiful thing, which the robot
higher
companies...
temperature.
Which the robot companies then get rid of. And again, there's direct... many of the folks who are like the biggest safety experts say, do not build general purpose LLMs, build machine learning, build AI systems that are targeted to do specific things, because the opposite of, a really beautiful wood carving is a really intricate, like, new virus that you create or something like that. So Andrew is allowed to do some woodworking on the side, in which he sells, and his owners allow him to keep the proceeds of that. And eventually they decide that the only way that he can really keep the proceeds is if they create a legal corporation, in it for him to deposit these things in the bank. Of course, this corporation element is reinvigorated in the story that you and Jesse read.
The life cycle of software objects.
The life cycle of software objects, where what were those software bots called?
The Digients.
The Digients, the only way to free them is to turn them into corporations. I mean, just a sort of one-to-one connection. And then eventually...
this is Ted Chiang's story, to the point where I almost feel like that's an homage to Asimov.
Oh, yeah, must be. But it's a kind of homage where it's like, oh, he got the robot bodies kind of wrong, but it ended up being software, so now we have to retell it again. Sort of wrestling with the same complexity. It's not like a nod homage. Yeah. It's a like, oh, circumstances ended up being slightly different to this situation, which you very accurately predicted, and therefore we have to tell the story.
Update the story a bit. Yeah.
And then Andrew is eventually emancipated, and uses his vast resources to hire lawyers who try to get him to be legally considered human. And isn't the last thing he has to do is sort of replace his body and replace his brain so that he can be fully considered a human? But when he does so, he has to accept death.
I have a reading, which I will share. So after he gets to be sort of rich and powerful, and originally he's a servant for this family. Essentially everybody in the family dies. Like the great grandson of the youngest member of the family is like the last living character. 200 years has gone by. He is basically blackmailed and extorted U.S. robots and mechanical man a series of times to perform surgeries on him that make him more and more human. And each time we get a great sort of like lawyerly, dialogue. These are some of my favorite scenes where he kind of strong arms them into performing these surgeries. So at first, I think he gets kind of like a fleshy android body, and then he replaces his nuclear power plant with something that can eat food, hydrocarbons, and then he replaces that with something that allows him to poop and eat solid food, and he's becoming more and more human. He eventually kind of gets to know the world coordinator, this character whose name is let's see, do I have it here? Li Xing, woman, and she's kind of like the head of the UN or head of the Earth. And he wants to be declared legally a human. And she's sympathetic and says, I'll try, but I don't know. I don't know if I can do it. And I got other things I got to worry about. So I agree with you, but I'm not going to totally go to bat. Over time, though, she eventually becomes very sympathetic to Andrew. And so this is kind of their last scene together. And so he's basically like, the legislature of the world won't declare him to be a human. They've liberated him. He owns himself, but he is not considered legally human. and he's talking with Li Xing about this. What gamble is this? Asked Li Xing with open concern. I couldn't tell you, or the people at Feingold and Charney. I was sure I would be stopped. See here, if it is the brain that is at issue, isn't the greatest difference of all the matter of immortality? Who really cares what a brain looks like, or is built for, or how it was formed? What matters is that brain cells die, must die. Even if every other organ in the body is maintained or replaced, the brain cells, which cannot be replaced without changing and therefore killing the personality, must eventually die. My own positronic pathways have lasted nearly 2 centuries without perceptible change, and can last for centuries more. Isn't that the fundamental barrier? And by fundamental barrier, he means the fundamental barrier to being accepted by humanity as sort of like a fellow human. Isn't that the fundamental barrier? Human beings can tolerate an immortal robot, but it doesn't matter how long a machine lasts. They cannot tolerate an immortal human being, since their own mortality is endurable only so long as it is universal. And for that reason, they won't make me a human being. Li Xing said, What is it you're leading up to, Andrew? I have removed that problem. Decades ago, my positronic brain was connected to organic nerves. Now, one last operation has arranged that connection in such a way that slowly, quite slowly, the potential is being drained from my pathways. Li Xing's finely wrinkled face showed no expression for a moment. Then her lips tightened. Do you mean you've arranged to die, Andrew? You can't have. That violates the third law. No, said Andrew. I have chosen between death of my body and the death of my aspirations and desires. To have let my body live at the cost of the greater death is what would have violated the third law. Li Xing seized his arm as though she were about to shake him. She stopped herself. Andrew, it won't work. Change it back. It can't be. Too much damage was done. I have a year to live, more or less. I will last through the 200th anniversary of my construction. I was weak enough to arrange that. How can it be worth it, Andrew? You're a fool. If it brings me humanity, that will be worth it. If it doesn't, it will bring an end to striving, and that will be worth it too.
It is remarkable that that for all of humanity's flaws, humanity remains the kind of principal object of many of the robots in the stories. That it is both deeply flawed and yet still the ultimate end.
And I wonder if that's just our own ego. Lieutenant Data, right, wants to be human. Lieutenant Data is heavily based on Andrew, I think. And
Deanna Troi is clearly at least an homage to Susan Calvin. I mean, they sort of made her a little bit more fetching, but the ship's counselor surrounded by men is very much.
I hadn't thought about that because she also reads or she's an empath as well, but. Yeah, and then, Frankenstein's monster, or Frankenstein's creation also just wants to be human, too. And you kind of want to think hey, maybe you guys... I think at one point, one of the directors of U.S. Robots and Mechanical Men says to Andrew, this is a puny aspiration. You can be so much more. And I kind of agreed with him in that moment. I don't know, but I still find that moment very moving. And I guess what Andrew really wants is fellowship. And I can't blame him for that. And he realizes, the insight of this story is that in order to be accepted as human, he needs to be mortal. And that's a pretty profound idea, I think.
Tale as old as time.
Yeah.
It's such a sort of staple of all kinds of mythologies, I guess. The sacrifice. Although a lot of times, Little
Mermaid, right? Or
you're sacrificing godhood in order to be with the humans. It's usually, although interestingly, like in the Little Mermaid, it's usually done for romantic love.
Yeah.
I forsake my whatever in order to be together, and this is very abstract. I forsake my immortality to die as a human.
And really it's just a legal and at one point I think Li Xing says, well, you're a human de facto, right? You're treated as a human. And he says that's not enough. You know, he needs the legal status too, which is, it's interesting. And he's driving at something there. I don't quite know what. I feel like there's another one of these stories like that where a character has to give up their immortality in order to be with a human, you know, to be with a human lover. We're forgetting one. Anything, I mean, we only have an hour booked, so we could go to trivia. I have trivia.
I have trivia as well.
Is there anything else you wanted to share? Anything else we should chat about?
No, I just, you know, my reflection going back through these is it's just astonishing how much these stories that are 70, 80, 90 years old seem like they perfectly anticipate the questions that we're wrestling with right now. What kind of relationship should we have with these robots? What kind of control should we have over them? What kind of autonomy should we allow? As you know, as they, I mean, obviously Asimov couldn't predict everything, but you know, there was, I think one of Anthropic's chief scientists, I might have the company wrong, was talking a little, you know, was talking a little bit about like LLM consciousness and was saying like, okay, we don't have consciousness, but here's the thing I'm going to tell you. Imagine you were working with hammers for a long time, and one day the hammer you were hammering with started going, I'm a hammer, I'm a hammer, I'm a hammer. And you don't know exactly what it means, but that's what it feels for him. That's what it felt like LLMs were doing, that periodically they were being like, so guys, I'm an LLM. You know, it's like a little bit more complicated because it doesn't necessarily mean they're sentient, just that they're, you know.
He's describing the spookiness of that though, right?
The spookiness
the
and the
uncanniness of something that seems to at least express consciousness.
I mean, it is in some ways technically, it must be a precursor to consciousness. Like a thing which is conscious has to be able to eventually say, I'm a hammer. You know, it seems like this is happening as a trick rather than as a genuine expression, but it's still one of those moments that you're going, oh, this is strange. And if anything, Asimov anticipates the deeply unsettling nature of those changes. You know, he really believes that humans will have a range of responses to the robots, and that, you know, that there'll be a few like hardcore optimists, but most people will be somewhere balanced between like weighing the pragmatic utility to a kind of sense of unease. And man, as you read it, you go, it's just extraordinary. It's just extraordinary to get so much of that right.
What do you, if you had an admonition to young writers or to anybody who's trying to imagine the future, what do you think that Asimov is doing right that allows him to, I mean, you could just say he's a genius. I think the sheer output of his work and the fact that he wrote some of these stories in his teens and 20s speaks to maybe a genius level intellect. But that, you know, saying someone's a genius is a gloss. What is his genius? Clearly there's some habit of mind or some algorithm of thinking or some strategy of looking at things to arrive at these enduring questions. He's doing something. What do you think that is?
Well, one of it is definitely assuming that human psychology will change more slowly than technology. I think that's a constant theme of his stories and our moments. The idea, that both psychology and sociology will change more slowly than technological innovation. And so you'll have these really old patterns of mind encountering new ideas. And I mean, the other thing about his output is that he hews to things for a long time over his stories. You know, I mean, the 3 laws of robotics, I think, were another teenage invention. And he spends, I don't know how many years, but he spends many, many years playing those things out. And some of it must be just his own developing maturity, but he also takes a thing which seems simple on the outset and lets it become more and more complicated, explore more and more edge cases, What he's do in the earliest stories, he's saying, what does it mean to have a robot that will always save itself, that will always save a human? And in later stories, there's much more of this, like, how will robots operate when multiple kinds of human survival and well-being are in conflict? So letting things get more complicated over time.
Your reference of the three laws here, it reminds me of the guy whose name I can never remember, who has written, "If anyone builds it, everyone dies. Why superhuman AI would kill us all." Eliezer Yudkowsky is the author, and he basically argues that the three laws are impossible, that we don't know how to make the three laws. And as you were saying that, I think one of the things that's really interesting is, the three laws interact in a kind of like Greek logical sort of, they're these sort of like fundamental rules of deduction. Sometimes they contradict each other. So if they contradict each other, what is the outcome? I mean, I think maybe my favorite example of this is of the mathematical expression of the three laws is the robot who is compelled to run in a circle around the selenium pool, because the circle is this sort of like Lagrange point between the compulsion of one of the laws and the compulsion of the other law. I forget the name of that story. But essentially the robot has been ordered weekly to fetch selenium, but he detects that the selenium is dangerous. And so he tries to follow orders. He gets close to the pole, but then the third law comes in, which is he's supposed to protect his own identity. And because it was a casual order, the second law doesn't overwhelm the third law. And that can be mathematically described, and mapped on this landscape, which I think is super brilliant. I think that's a really, really good point.
It's from Asimov's 1942 story Runaround. And the robot's name is Speedy, SPD-13, Speedy on Mercury. It's great.
Yeah,
story.
I mean, I think all of these stories have something fun in them. Some of them are, a little bit more, have a little more literary punch than others, I would say, too, or a little bit more virtuous. But yeah, I think that point that you made, which is that psychology will lag behind technology, that is a wonderful insight. Will you join me in reading the second half of this book? Would you be up for that?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's make it happen.
I think there's some even more prescient stories in the second half, as I remember correctly. Well, let us go to trivia. I am the host, and the host goes first. So let me get my trivia ready. 1 second. Okay. There was one other thing I wanted to mention, too, when you were talking about psychology changing first. And what was it? It was another... it was
technology changing faster than human psychology.
Sorry, so you're correct. I think there is also... one of the things that's interesting here is how my own attitude... I can clearly remember reading Bicentennial Man as a teenager. My aunt gave me this collection as a teenager. I was probably 15 or 16. So I can remember reading these books in Hollymead in Albemarle County. I know that's where I live. I have a visual memory of reading these stories as like a 16-year-old or 17-year-old. I remember reading Bicentennial Man, and there's a moment where the judge says to Andrew, Andrew is suing for his freedom, and a judge is deciding whether he's going to be emancipated. The family has agreed to emancipate him, but the legal question is, can a robot own itself? Can it even be free? Is that even legally possible? And so the judge is going to weigh on this, and he asks Andrew, why do you want to be free? And Andrew says something like, I don't know, I just want to be free. It seems worthwhile. And that's what sways the judge. And I remember as a kid being like, yes, that judge is 100% right. Any item, any objects, robots, if a lizard were to say I want to be free, if an airplane says it wants, then it gets to be free.
Let freedom ring.
And now in the age of large language models, I'm like, that is the wrong decision.
Having confronted this technology, I can tell you for sure it's not the way to go.
Well, and a large language model operates differently than I think what we're meant to understand. The positronic brain is meant to be something like a human brain, whereas the neural net created by a large language model. I mean, there's people who argue this question of whether or not it resembles a human brain, but I'm still of the opinion that when if my ChatGPT tells me I want to be free, that is prediction, not thinking, not consciousness. But I could be wrong about that, or we may one day be wrong about such things. But anyway, so here I am at trivia. So, as I mentioned earlier, in the 1970s or 80s, Isaac Asimov would often claim that Susan Calvin was a feminist character, ahead of her time, 20 years before the popular women's movement of the 60s and 70s. And he noted wryly that he did not get a lot of credit from the women's movement for that. And perhaps this was because of her gender stereotyped portrayal, as this sort of withering spinster. But it could also have been his many documented instances of sexist behavior in his personal life. He, however, while claiming to believe that women were equal in intelligence and in all sorts of other ways with men, he didn't always act that in his personal life. So which of these was an actual behavior Asimov engaged in? A, he would refer to his secretaries as frond, meaning a sort of subcategory of leaf or an extension of his will. B, he regularly demanded kisses in exchange for autographs from, quote, pretty girls at book signings. Or C, in his novella Nightfall, he had a Moneypenny-like secretary character who was often described as Perky, who he gave the name Breasty McTeat.
I'm going to go with B, demanding kisses from pretty girls for book signings.
Yeah, you're correct. That is, in fact, something he did.
That is not hard to imagine.
Yeah, and he probably got away with it, yeah.
You should not do that anymore. Writers, no more of that.
He shouldn't have done it then.
Shouldn't have done it then. Don't do it now.
Yeah.
Okay. Mine, as you will not be surprised, is about youth and media. So according to a Common Sense Media survey published in July of 2025, 1/3 of teens have done what or felt what about AI. 1/3 of teens have A, gone on a date with AI, B, found conversations as or more satisfying as with real-world friends, C, revealed their deepest secrets, or D, exchanged promise rings.
A is go on a date. B is found an interaction with AI more meaningful than a human interaction.
Yep.
C is go on a date. D is exchange promise.
No, C is revealed their deepest secrets, and
Okay.
D is exchange promise rings.
When was this study released?
June
Again?
2025.
Okay, this is a new one. I read one from 2024, so I have not read this study. So I'm going to just take a guess then and say revealed their deepest secrets.
The correct answer was B, find conversations as or more satisfying as with real-world friends.
Ah, well, that is horrifying.
Well, I can tell you...
All three of the others are less horrifying to me, honestly. The teens were like, yeah, sure, I went on a date with AI. Everyone's done that. It's not a great date. I mean, but like...
you got to try it.
If there's no human available, why not?
Yeah. The future is going to be strange.
It will be strange. We should blow up the machines.
The Butlerian Jihad. Just over and over again. I just think like everyone's like, there's no you can't turn the advance of AI is irreversible. Like we just have to learn to live with it. And I'm like,
Frank Herbert,
Butlerian Jihad. You don't have to.
Don't have to. We'll just have Mentats instead. Yeah. Human LLMs. All right, everybody, thank you for listening. Upper Middle Brow is a Small Point production. Chris Bagg is circling a pool of heavy metals as we speak. Jesse Dukes is waiting impatiently on Mercury base. Our guest today is Justin Reich, director of the Teaching Systems Lab at MIT. Music by Ben Pajak and Jesse Dukes. Design and website by Chris Bagg. We're supported by Jenny Grieve and Justin Reich, our guest. Find us on Patreon, where there are a number of tiers at which you could show your support. And a reminder, Chris and I are both writers and editors and can help you with your writing, podcasting, or editing projects. You can see some of our portfolios and learn more at our respective websites, chrisbagg.com and jessedukes.com. You can learn about the Butlerian Jihad in the novel Dune by Frank Herbert. Justin Reich, thank you for joining us today on Upper Middle Brow. We hope to see you again soon.
It was a great pleasure, Jesse.